Healing Wisdom is made possible by members like you and sustaining members like Michael Brabowski. You can become a sustaining member of WOMR for as little as $15 a month. For more information, call 508-487-2619 or visit our website at WOMR.org, where you can learn more about legacy gifts and planned giving. You're tuned in to 92.1 WOMR FM Provincetown and 91.3 WFMR FM Orleans, the voice and spirit of Cape Cod. I bid you welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, chartered herbalist and psychic medium. Healing Wisdom explores mind, body, soul connections as we discuss the healing effects of the arts, metaphysical concepts, intuition, and the spiritual aspects of everyday living. Healing Wisdom begins in the heart. Our theme music is provided by Mystic Pete. Hello, welcome to Healing Wisdom. My guest today is Keith Stokes, author of A Matter of Truth, Vice President of the 1696 Heritage Group, former Executive Director of the Rhode Island Economic Development Corporation and Executive Director of the Newport County Chamber of Commerce, and former advisor for Rhode Island with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Welcome, Keith. Thank you for being here.
No, thank you, Pandora. Thanks for having me on. The 1696 Heritage Group was founded by my wife and I a few years back as we were doing a significant amount of research, interpretation, exhibit programming for African heritage institutions, not only across the country, but across the diaspora. So we've had the privilege to be able to work in places like the Bahamas, Barbados, Curacao, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Ghana. And it's given us a real appreciation of the history and literally the resiliency of African heritage people. So 1696 stands for the date in Rhode Island history when the first documented slave ship arrived from Barbados via what is today Ghana or the Gold Coast. And it arrived called the Seaflower in August of 1696. And it transported 24 enslaved Africans. Half were left in Newport, which is my home in Newport, Rhode Island, and the other group was brought overground to Boston. So to us, the 1696 Heritage Group is an opportunity to not only begin to interpret the early history of African heritage people, but largely from the perspective and using primary, secondary sources and documentation of the African people themselves. And I think that's something that's been missing in the interpretation. When I was a very young boy, my grandmother in Newport reminded me that Black history is not slavery. In fact, Black history is actually the history of the people and how we survived and thrived despite slavery. So for me, it's been a lifelong pursuit of telling the story of the people of color from their perspective and their experience arriving in the Americas. And it's been something that's been a passion. My wife runs the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. So we've been intimately involved for many, many years in all aspects of interpreting this very rich and very exciting history.
You've collected over 600 primary and secondary documents and historical artifacts highlighting these 400 years of Providence and Rhode Island history. And you recently went to Ghana for the 400th anniversary of the beginning of this slave trade. Can you talk about what that experience is like?
My young adult children, my 4 children, they would represent the 10th generation in Newport. So we go way back. We're proud of the fact that we go way back, and our ancestors were of diverse racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. So sometimes when people think of New England and certainly Newport, they tend to think of early English America and colonial America from that perspective, when in fact, my ancestors were some of the first enslaved Africans, first Sephardic Jews that arrived. So our experience being Americans and being Newport and Rhode Island residents is not unique. It's something that was shared by many, many families. Unfortunately, the history books sometimes don't reflect the diversity that's always been a part of our country and a part of our world. Several years ago, as a part of the recognition of the 400th anniversary of the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade in at least English British North America and Virginia, a number of countries across the diaspora were celebrating. I was asked to come to Ghana to participate in a international forum on the history of enslaved people. I was actually asked to come and tell my personal story. My maternal grandfather's ancestors not only originated from what is today Ghana, it would have been the Gold Coast at that time, and they were taken away and transported through the Middle Passage to Jamaica. And then a son was born, and that boy in 1795 was brought to Philadelphia and Newport. We're one of the few families that actually have artifacts and documents that trace back even before enslavement. So it was exciting for me, Pandora, to be invited to come back to Ghana. But more importantly, I was physically brought to the slave castle, Fort William in Ananabo, where my ancestor was captured and eventually was taken and transported to Jamaica, to the New World, for enslavement. So it was a very powerful experience for me. What was really neat was when I arrived there, the village elder, the families gathered around me, and they brought me to the slave fortress. We walked through that fortress, and we went through the dungeons where human beings were once kept captive and then eventually sent on ships forever to be in permanent servitude, including my ancestor. And many of these slave fortresses that dot across the Gold Coast or Ghana today, many of them have large doors that separate the beachfront and from the interior of the castle. And these doors are sometimes called the doors of no return, because once you pass that door and you go onto the beach, you're taken on a vessel and you never return to the African soil. So about 50 of the villagers brought me to this door and they asked me to push it open. And when I pushed it open, everyone started to applaud and everyone cheered because they said, you came back. So for you, it's not the door of no return, it's the door of return. And we spent the entire day sharing heritage and culture. So it was not a discussion about slavery. We weren't discussing about European slave traders. We were talking about the Ashanti and the Fanti people and my own ancestors. They were excited of the fact that I not only survived because I exist over 250 years later, but the fact that I still maintain my African connection. And that was something was special. So I wish every African heritage person across the diaspora had a chance to return to the African soil and had a chance that I had to be able to meet the very people who were a part of your very early origins. And we're not talking about slavery. We're not talking about racism and discrimination. We're talking about our culture, our heritage, our language, all the things that, despite slavery and discrimination, still survive in America today. I mean, rap music and jazz music has its origins in African music. Many of our customs, our food sources, many of our actual trades are all tied to early African customs and trades and such. So for me, it's a celebration of who I am. I'm so much more than just an American citizen. I'm an African heritage citizen of the world, and I'm proud of that. And I will point out the term that I use, and I like to use, is African heritage rather than African American, because African heritage, I think it recognizes the fact that I share a heritage and a culture with someone who might be from the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico or Cuba or Newark, New Jersey or Charleston, South Carolina or Nigeria, but we all have an African heritage. So I think that's a very powerful way to finally bring us all together and celebrate who we are as a people.
Yes, indeed. And the culture of Africa was a very sophisticated culture, both in terms of religion and also the trades and all of this industry that was happening at that time, pre-colonialism and certainly pre-transatlantic slave trade.
Many times we think of Africa as a country, not a continent of many countries that has its own ancient existence that go back eons. And at the time of European arrival and exploration from Northern Africa and then later into Western Africa and beyond, they were not coming across uncivilized people. They were actually coming in contact with highly civilized, organized institutions. Many of them were already active in a variety of trade and trade skills. In fact, as I'd said earlier, and I'm very proud to be a native Newport, Rhode Islander, but very few people realize the most active slave trading port in British North America during the colonial era is Newport, Rhode Island. Newport sent more slave ships to the West African coast than any other colonial city of its kind, more than New York or Boston or Charleston or any of those. So it's Newport. So coming from Newport and being involved in this and understanding this, I also realized that many of the Africans that were brought back to the New World and eventually to places like Newport were not brought back to work in large agricultural-based economies. I mean, New England doesn't have the weather or the soil or the climate to support the cash crops. And we normally think about slavery in the Western Hemisphere. So there's no rice plantations or sugar plantations or tobacco or all those things that we tend to think of in the American South and in the West Indies and South America didn't really exist in New England in the colonial era. So many of the enslaved Africans that were brought here, many of them were brought to be trained in trade skills. My own ancestor, when he arrived in 1795 as an 8-year-old boy, he loses his African name, he's given a Christian name, but he's trained as a Windsor chairmaker and then later as a cabinet maker, because that's what would have been the demand working in Philadelphia and Newport at that time. So we now have primary documents of Africans that are involved in every trade that you could possibly think of and being trained in those trade skills. Women are trained to be seamstress and sail lofts. We have men as chocolate grinders, as snuff makers and rum makers and carpenters and barrel makers. So it's important to recognize that the reason that Africans from what is today Ghana were highly sought after is that the Europeans, particularly the Rhode Island merchants, recognized that many of them had already very sophisticated trade skills. They were leather makers, they were goldsmiths, silversmiths. So they already had these fine skills to immediately be brought to the New World and take up successfully and efficiently those same trades. So it's important that we recognize this, because when we think of Africans arriving, they're not a blank slate. They're bringing their language, their foodstuffs, their religions, and their trade skills. And all those things become a part of the building of early America or in the entire Americas. In fact, I would suggest if it wasn't for largely West Africans, what would the Americas be today?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a really complicated history with Rhode Island, because there were a lot of mariners who were free people, and then there were those who were enslaved who went back to be part of the system of capture. And there were many people who fled from Boston and other areas and found their freedom in Rhode Island. I would love for you to just share some of that complicated history.
Well, it's been a challenge. After 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement, many cities were beginning to have discussions about designing and developing and deploying reparation efforts. And the city of Providence was very similar to that. And Mayor Jorge Elorza formed by the end of 2020 a very formal African-American ambassador group. And this group comprised over 100 African-American men, women, across all different backgrounds of skills, education, interest, training. And their whole purpose was to really begin to think strategically, where have we been, where we are today, and where we'd like to be. So as a part of that process, the mayor and his African-American group created what was called the Research, Reconciliation, and Reparation Effort. And I was asked to come in and work with the historical institutions and really do a very detailed study on the history of racialized discrimination in the city of Providence from 1620 to 2020, over a 4-century period of time. It was a bit of a challenge, but we were able to work with historical institutions, not only across the state, but across the country, had access to digitized documents. And what we ended up creating, the Matter of Truth report, is a very systematic highlight of the evolution of racialized discrimination from the very landing of the Europeans at Providence and their interaction with the indigenous people who had existed in Rhode Island and this country for centuries before, and then the early introduction of enslaved Africans. And then we move forward into the 19th and 20th century. In fact, one of the things that I've heard from a number of people after reading the report is that it's really not slavery and slave trade that had the greatest negative impact on people of color. It's many of the things that were going on in the 20th century. There was discrimination in employment, in housing. There was discrimination in access to healthcare, where you could live. I mean, the segregated communities by race and ethnicity in Providence in the early 20th century are still the same segregated communities largely in the 21st century. If we were ever to measure the impact COVID has had, devastating impact it's had across the world, but if we look at it very carefully and peel back the demographics and numbers, people of color, largely limited income, living in poor communities, have seen and have weathered the most worst impacts of the COVID, both from health, social, and economic aspects. So one of the things that we try to explain in the Matter of Truth report is that slavery just evolved into racialized discrimination, and it still exists, unfortunately, with us today, and it still creates significant gaps in wealth and opportunity between people based upon race, ethnicity, and zip code if they live in a limited income neighborhood. And that was the power of that report. And now the next step is the city will be announcing a reparations commission. We'll bring together people to begin to create strategies of investment to close those gaps in wealth and equity and opportunity so that all Providence citizens, regardless of race or ethnicity or religious orientation, have a right to prosper and a right to succeed in a great city, in a great state in Rhode Island.
Can you talk a little bit more specifically? I know you're working on a project right now that is connected to this. Can you talk about what the objectives are in terms of reparations?
Well, I think, the R word, reparations, is very emotional. It brings a lot of emotion and explosiveness when people hear the word. I tend to see it less as reparations and more as reinvestment and investing in people and institutions and communities who, for a wide variety of documented reasons, have not been able to succeed in Rhode Island or in Providence or in America. But I also look at it from a very pragmatic perspective. In the Matter of Truth report, we talk about the census. And the reality is, the documented reality is that over the next several decades, the majority of the people in the United States of America will be largely people of color, led by the Latino community. So if we're thinking about 2050, 30 years from now, what Rhode Island will look like or what America will look like, a large percentage of the majority of the population will be Latino people and people of color. So doesn't it just make practical sense that we invest in those people today? Because those majority people will be our future visitor, customer, council member, school committee member, teacher, engineer, doctor. So investing in people today will only invest in having a stronger Rhode Island or a stronger America for tomorrow. So I see it from a very pragmatic standpoint. If we can do a better job of having students graduate and graduate with skills and graduate with opportunities from high school, that benefits everyone. If we can do a better job of taking people out of poverty and into full middle class life where they have choices of where they live, where they work, where they send their kids to school, that makes a stronger community and a stronger society. So I don't see this as reparations, as somehow paying for the sins of slavery. I see this as dismantling an existing structural racist system that still discriminates against men, women, and families simply because they may not look like or speak like or worship like whoever the majority of America has been.
Indeed. And when you read these quotes, like in the Matter of Truth, just in reading all these historical quotes, to see the belief in the ideology, in the manifest destiny, in this providence, and this God-given entitlement to totally dismantling cultures which revere each other, give respect to nature, which are, so cohesive and compassion-based. It's so striking to see, to read the words of, say, clergymen, to kind of get a glimpse of this puritanical mindset that then is at the foundation of all of our institutions and this systemic racism. I mean, it's just very sobering and fascinating and strange. And I think a lot of people try to justify slavery and say, oh, well, in Africa, they had slavery, but you make some good points about the main differences between pre-colonial slavery and slavery in America. Can you talk about, being born into the system of slavery and the fundamental differences?
Well, it's important to recognize that when you begin able to interpret the primary documents, the words from the merchants, the settlers themselves, and how they saw themselves in settling and building upon this new America. I mean, again, here in New England, we're called the New England colonies. We're not the New England settlements. They're colonies because the entire intent was to colonize, to control, to own, to possess. So it's important that we understand that. That is the words of our founding European settlers. It's also important to recognize, and it's almost ironic as we still work our way through COVID and how devastating it was. It's important to recognize how devastating European arrival was to the American continent, to the Americas, for the indigenous people. And as we point out in the Matter of Truth report, between 1616 and 1619, that 3-year period, that's a year before the famous or infamous Plymouth Rock landing of 1620. Over that 3-year period, because of early French, Portuguese, and English settlers and who were settling and exploring and trading from the Maine coast down to Cape Cod. During that 3-year period, the indigenous people that had contact with those European explorers died of horrible European-born diseases. Today, we recognize as cholera. What's important is that nearly 80% of the indigenous population died in that 3-year period. So at the time of 1620 going forward, there was very few indigenous tribes, indigenous people along the coast, the Atlantic coast from Maine down to Rhode Island, that would stop or interfere with this colonization effort. So it's important to recognize the fact that it's this first introduction of disease, of European disease, that devastates the indigenous people, that significantly cripples the indigenous people. And then by the middle part of the 17th century, you begin to have a series of devastating wars. The Pequot Wars in Connecticut, the King Philip Wars in Rhode Island and Massachusetts devastate many of the remaining indigenous people. But it's also important to recognize that what drove the early colonizers was their absolute religious belief. They actually called New England, and it's important that people recognize this, they called it English Israel. They saw themselves and compared themselves in the Old Testament of the Jews who were cast out and were able to be rescued by the hand of God and left Egypt to find their land of milk and honey, and finally to find a place that they could worship freely God as Jews. Well, they saw themselves as the 17th century English version as Israelite Jews. And through God's hand, God had brought them to the Americas, and God had allowed them to wipe away the native people either by disease or by war and take possession of land so they could prosper and multiply. And they certainly did. Now, I'm not here to take my 21st century political views and values and cast doubt or negativity on a 17th century European colonizer. But the point is that we need to realize that is how that's how the Americas were established. They were established brutally, and they were established for the purposes of not freedom and democracy for all, but freedom and then eventually democracy for a very small few. Even in the case of the settlement of Providence, Rhode Island, Roger Williams, who was our early European founder and settler, he was absolutely clear by establishing our charter of 1663. That charter is very specific to say that the charter allows citizenship and free life for Protestant Christians. If you were not Protestant, you were not Christian, you could not be a citizen of the colony of Rhode Island. Those rights of freedom of what we call today civil liberties were not made available to non-Protestant Christians because those were the majority of the people who had landed here, and they were looking to build a Protestant Christian colony of Rhode Island, or a colony of Massachusetts, or a colony of Connecticut, or Virginia. So it's important that we recognize these things. And as the indigenous people had died out largely, or were captured, were subjugated, as land needed to be worked, buildings needed to be built, ships needed to be built and manned, enslaved Africans were brought in by the droves to fill that workforce. One of the things that's important to separate African slavery versus world slavery is the fact that what was introduced in the Americas and was perfected, particularly in America during the 17th and 18th century, was a series of laws that would establish that slavery was inheritable. If you were born to an enslaved African heritage woman, you were born a slave for life. No time in world history did you have this comprehensive, integrated, inheritable slave system. In previous systems of slavery, going back to ancient times, it was through war, it was through debt, it was through some level of conquering, but it was not something passed on to the next generation. In fact, what makes the African slave system so complete, and then later in the 19th century, so devastatingly complete, is the fact that women now become the very center of not only supporting, but sustaining an enslaved system. So the focus of subjugating African heritage women becomes an all-out priority into the 18th and 19th century, because that African heritage slave woman was producing a very valuable commodity, which was slave children. So all these things are well documented through primary, secondary sources. They've always existed, but they've not taken center stage because, candidly, the people who interpret history then are not the people who interpret history today. People who are interpreting history today and bringing it to the forefront have a much greater interest in presenting the facts not only from a European perspective, but from a perspective of many other men, women, and families who also existed and lived and worked and worshiped in early Rhode Island or America. And I'm excited about this because, again, without having full access to the truth, there's just no way we can have a sense of really who we are as a people and how we can progress as a people.
12.5 million men, women, and children from the African continent to the Americas and West Indies over a 3.5 century period. And also the Royal African Company transported an average of 5,000 slaves a year and constructed slave forts along the West African coast from Morocco to the Cape of Good Hope. And I found it very interesting that the majority of people taken from the African continent went to South America. So that's a whole other story. But I appreciate the work that you're doing. Thank you so much, Keith Stokes, for joining us, talking a little bit about this history.
No, thank you for having me. I think the most important thing for people to recognize is that for African heritage people, our history is so much more than our racial trauma. And slavery is an incredibly important aspect of our history. It's how many of us arrived here, but it shouldn't define us. And there is so much unrecovered history that talks about the people, our culture, our heritage. I was fortunate to grow up in a household where it was really cool to be Black. I mean, because I was able to connect with ancestors before enslavement, and more importantly, who survived and thrived despite slavery or despite the Civil War and discrimination and Jim Crow, and even here in New England. So for me, it was a sense of power. And I'm always very excited when I can connect with kids of color, particularly African heritage kids, and give them a sense of the power that they have and that their ancestors have. And again, here in Newport, and we invite people to come to Newport, we have the oldest African burying ground in America, right here in Newport. It dates back to the early 18th century. And many of the markers are actually carved by and represent early enslaved and free Africans dating back to the 18th century. So we're very proud of that because, again, people come to Newport and they enjoy our jazz and our sailing and our music and our mansions, but they don't even realize the fact that many of the earliest contributors to Newport's history were people of African heritage. And when young kids get to see that and feel that, I can't tell you how excited they get because all of a sudden, history is not about them, it is them. So thanks for having me on and certainly love to come back. And again, this is a great journey that we're all looking forward to share with even many more people.
Thank you, Keith. Folks can go to 1696heritage.com for more information about your firm. Thank you so much. You've been listening to Healing Wisdom, a Thursday morning weekly show featuring guests who share their journeys and expertise, providing us with food for thought. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, Reiki and shamanic practitioner. You can find Healing Wisdom podcasts at WOMR.org or on Facebook and Instagram pages. We're listening to O Mashe Bello from Alessandro Esposito. You can find his music at soundcloud.com/Alessandro-Esposito-10.